After 40 years of marriage, my husband Richard walked out on me for his 28-year-old secretary, claiming he deserved happiness in his golden years, and that I had become nothing more than an expensive burden he could no longer afford to carry. What he didn't know was that for the past 15 years, I had been the anonymous majority shareholder of Hartwell Industries, the very company he believed he had built from nothing, and by the time he finished moving his belongings into his secretary's downtown apartment, I had already called an emergency board meeting that would strip him of everything he thought was his, while I reclaimed what had always been mine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of September 15th started like any other Tuesday in our sprawling estate in Millbrook Heights. I was in my garden, tending to the prize-winning roses that had become my passion project over the decades, when I heard Richard's Mercedes pull into our circular driveway earlier than usual. At 72, he rarely came home before sunset anymore, always claiming that Hartwell Industries demanded his constant attention, that the manufacturing empire he had supposedly built required his personal oversight of every detail. "Victoria," he called from the French doors leading to our terrace, his voice carrying that particular tone I had learned to recognize over 4 decades of marriage, the one that meant he had already made a decision and was simply informing me of the consequences. I set down my gardening shears and walked toward the house, noting how he remained in the doorway rather than stepping outside to join me. Richard Hartwell had always been a handsome man, silver-haired and distinguished, the kind of presence that commanded attention in boardrooms and charity galas. Even now, approaching his 73rd birthday, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never questioned his own importance. "We need to talk," he said, straightening his Armani tie, a nervous habit I had observed countless times over the years. I followed him into our living room, with its cathedral ceilings and carefully curated collection of contemporary art that I had selected and purchased over the years. Richard took his usual position by the massive stone fireplace, hands clasped behind his back in what I privately called his CEO stance, the posture he adopted when delivering news he considered significant. "Victoria, I'm going to be direct because after 40 years, I believe you deserve honesty." He paused, studying my face as if gauging my reaction before continuing. "I'm leaving. Our marriage is over." I lowered myself into the cream-colored armchair that had been my preferred seat for the past decade, keeping my expression neutral despite the words hitting me like a physical blow. "I see," I managed, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I've been unhappy for years," he continued, pacing now in front of the fireplace. "We've grown apart, become strangers living in the same house. I'm 72 years old, Victoria. I don't have time to waste on a relationship that died years ago." The clinical way he discussed our marriage, as if it were a failing business venture, shouldn't have shocked me. Richard had always approached life with the same detached analysis he brought to corporate acquisitions and quarterly reports. But hearing him reduce 4 decades to a series of financial and emotional calculations still felt surreal. "Is there someone else?" I asked, though something in his demeanor had already provided the answer. He had the grace to look uncomfortable for a moment before nodding. "Natasha. She understands me in ways that, well, in ways that you and I haven't connected in years." Natasha Kellaway. I knew the name, of course. Richard's executive assistant for the past 3 years. A stunning blonde with an MBA from Wharton and ambitions that had always seemed to extend beyond scheduling meetings and managing his calendar. 28 years old, recently divorced, with the kind of sharp intelligence that I had once possessed before I had chosen to channel it into supporting Richard's career, rather than building my own. "How long?" I asked, surprised by my own calm. "Does it matter?" He stopped pacing and faced me directly. "Victoria, I'm not doing this to hurt you. I'm doing this because life is short, and I refuse to spend whatever years I have left pretending to be happy." I studied his face, noting the way his jaw set with determination, the slight defensive tilt of his shoulders. This wasn't a sudden decision, I realized. This was a carefully planned announcement, delivered with the same strategic timing he brought to major business moves. "What about the house?" I asked, gesturing around the 8,000 square foot estate that had been our home for 25 years. "You can stay through the holidays," he said, his tone suggesting this was a generous concession. "After that, we'll need to sell. The proceeds will be divided according to whatever our lawyers work out, but realistically, most of our assets are tied up in Hartwell Industries. You'll be comfortable, but the lifestyle—" He shrugged. "That will need to change." The casual dismissal of our shared life, the assumption that I would simply accept whatever terms he and his lawyers decided were fair, might have devastated another woman. But as I sat in that expensive chair, surrounded by the luxury that Richard believed he was taking away from me, I felt something unexpected: relief. For 15 years I had been living with a secret that Richard, for all his business acumen, had never discovered. The trust fund my grandmother had left me, the inheritance Richard had always dismissed as a modest sum that helped with household expenses, had been worth significantly more than I had ever revealed. More importantly, the careful investments I had made with that money, the strategic acquisitions I had orchestrated through a series of shell companies and anonymous partnerships, had given me something Richard couldn't imagine: power. Real power. Corporate power, the kind of influence that could reshape lives and destroy carefully constructed empires. "I'll have my lawyers contact yours," Richard was saying, mistaking my silence for shock or grief. "This doesn't have to be ugly, Victoria. We can handle this like civilized adults." I nodded slowly, already planning my next moves. "Of course, Richard, whatever you think is best." He seemed relieved by my acquiescence, perhaps having expected tears or arguments or desperate pleas for reconciliation. Instead, I simply stood and walked him to the door, kissing his cheek goodbye as I had done thousands of times over the decades. "Take care of yourself," I said softly, watching him drive away toward his new life with Natasha Kellaway. As his car disappeared around the corner, I returned to my garden and picked up my gardening shears. But instead of returning to the roses, I walked to my private study and opened the locked file cabinet that contained documents Richard had never seen. Partnership agreements, stock certificates, board resolutions, evidence of the secret I had been protecting for 15 years. Tomorrow, Richard Hartwell would discover that the company he thought he owned, the empire he believed he had built, had actually belonged to someone else all along. Tomorrow, he would learn that walking away from our marriage meant walking away from everything he thought was his. But tonight I would tend to my roses and plan the most important business meeting of my life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The following morning I woke to find Richard's side of the bed already cold and empty, his usual coffee cup absent from the kitchen counter, and a brief note propped against the fruit bowl informing me that he would be staying at the Grandview Hotel downtown while apartment hunting with Natasha. What should have been a devastating blow instead felt like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place, the moment I had been unconsciously preparing for since the day I first suspected that my husband's late nights at the office involved more than quarterly reports and merger negotiations. I made my coffee in the silence of our expansive kitchen, savoring the unusual peace that filled the house without Richard's morning routine of phone calls and financial news broadcasts. Through the bay windows, I could see the grounds crew arriving to maintain our 5-acre property, their familiar presence, a reminder of the life Richard assumed I would soon lose. If only he knew that every month for the past 15 years their paychecks had ultimately been signed by me. My phone buzzed with a text from my daughter Catherine, who lived in Portland with her family. "Mom, Dad called this morning. Are you okay? Do you want me to fly out?" Catherine. My brilliant, successful daughter who had inherited Richard's business mind, but thankfully none of his callousness. At 38, she ran her own digital marketing firm and had never needed to depend on a man for security. I had made sure of that, secretly funding her education and startup costs through untraceable channels, wanting her to have the independence I had sacrificed in my youth. I typed back, "I'm fine, sweetheart, just processing everything. Don't change your plans." The truth was, I needed time alone to execute what would happen next. Catherine didn't know about my secret business activities. No one did, and I intended to keep it that way until the moment of revelation would have maximum impact. At 10 a.m., I drove my silver Jaguar to downtown Millbrook, parking in the executive garage beneath the 40-story glass tower that housed Hartwell Industries. The building Richard believed he had purchased and developed 20 years ago, the crown jewel of his supposed empire, gleaming in the morning sunlight like a monument to his success. I took the executive elevator to the 42nd floor, where the corporate offices occupied the top 3 levels of the building. Richard's secretary, his former secretary, I corrected myself, sat at the reception desk outside his corner office. Emma Rodriguez had worked for the company for 8 years, a competent woman in her 50s, who had always treated me with polite deference during my occasional visits. "Mrs. Hartwell," Emma said, surprise evident in her voice as she stood. "I wasn't expecting you today. Mr. Hartwell is—" "In a meeting, I'm sure," I finished smoothly. "Actually, Emma, I'm here to see Harold Kingsley. Is he available?" Harold Kingsley, the chief financial officer, had been with Hartwell Industries for 12 years. A meticulous man with wire-rimmed glasses and an encyclopedic knowledge of every financial transaction the company had ever made. Harold was one of only 3 people who knew the truth about the company's ownership structure. The others were my lawyer, James Morrison, and my financial advisor, Rebecca Chen, both of whom had helped orchestrate the careful acquisition that Richard had never suspected. Emma looked confused. "I can check, but perhaps I should let Mr. Hartwell know you're here first." "That won't be necessary," I said, maintaining the gentle smile I had perfected over decades of corporate social events. "Harold is expecting me." This was a lie, but one that would soon become irrelevant. I walked past Emma's desk toward the CFO's office, noting how she hesitated but ultimately didn't stop me. Authority, I had learned, was often about projection rather than official titles. Harold's door was open, and I could see him reviewing spreadsheets on his computer, his perpetually serious expression focused on the numbers that told the real story of Hartwell Industries. When he looked up and saw me standing in his doorway, his face went through a fascinating series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and then a dawning realization as he understood why I was there. "Victoria," he said carefully, standing and closing his office door behind me, "this is unexpected." "Harold," I replied, settling into the chair across from his desk, "I think it's time." He adjusted his glasses nervously. "Are you certain? Once we do this, there's no going back. Richard has made his choice," I interrupted. "Yesterday he informed me that our marriage is over, and that I should prepare to adjust to a significantly reduced lifestyle, because, as he put it, most of our assets are tied up in Hartwell Industries." Harold's expression shifted from nervous to almost admiring. "He actually said that?" "He did. He also mentioned that Natasha Kellaway would be helping him apartment hunt." I paused, letting the implications settle. "I assume you're aware of his relationship with his assistant?" Harold nodded grimly. "It's been obvious to anyone who pays attention. The extended lunch meetings, the frequent business trips she accompanies him on, the way she's been inserting herself into strategic decisions that are well above her pay grade. This last detail was new information to me, and I filed it away for future consideration. How extensive is her involvement in company operations?" "More than Richard realizes, I suspect," Harold said carefully. "She's been asking questions about company valuations, asset portfolios, potential acquisition targets. Questions that suggest either genuine business acumen or very specific coaching from someone with particular interests." The implications were troubling but not surprising. Natasha wasn't just a young woman having an affair with her boss. She was positioning herself strategically for whatever came next. Perhaps she truly loved Richard. Or perhaps she saw him as a pathway to the kind of wealth and influence she craved. Either way, her calculations were about to become irrelevant. "Harold," I said, pulling a manila folder from my purse, "I need you to schedule an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. sharp." He accepted the folder with hands that trembled slightly. Inside were copies of documents he had helped create over the years: incorporation papers, stock transfer agreements, proxy authorizations, and most importantly, the shell company structures that had allowed me to quietly acquire 67% of Hartwell Industries without triggering the disclosure requirements that would have alerted Richard to what was happening. "All 6 board members?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "All 6, including Richard." I stood, smoothing my skirt and checking my watch. "The agenda is simple: immediate termination of Richard Hartwell as CEO and president, followed by the installation of new executive leadership." Harold looked up from the documents, his expression mixing admiration with concern. "Victoria, you realize this will destroy him professionally? No other company will touch him after being terminated for cause from his own firm." "Harold," I said softly, "Richard just spent 40 years teaching me that in business, sentiment is a luxury we can't afford. He's about to receive the education he never intended to provide." As I walked back toward the elevator, I passed Richard's office and could hear his voice through the partially open door, animated and confident as he discussed expansion plans with someone, probably Natasha, given the time of day and Emma's absence from her desk. "The Q4 numbers are going to be exceptional," he was saying. "We're positioned for the biggest growth year in company history. Everything I've built is finally paying off." I paused for just a moment, listening to my husband of 40 years discuss the future of a company he didn't own, planning a life he wouldn't be able to afford, confident in a security that would evaporate in less than 24 hours. Tomorrow morning, Richard Hartwell would walk into a boardroom believing he was the master of his universe. By tomorrow afternoon, he would discover that the universe had belonged to someone else all along. And for the first time in years, I was looking forward to a board meeting. That evening, I sat in my home office reviewing the quarterly reports Harold had discreetly provided, cross-referencing them with my own private records of company performance and strategic decisions. What I discovered in those meticulously detailed financial statements was more shocking than Richard's affair, more devastating than his casual dismissal of our 4-decade marriage. My husband hadn't just been unfaithful, he had been systematically pillaging the company I secretly owned, funneling money through consulting contracts and bogus expense accounts that painted a picture of either breathtaking incompetence or deliberate embezzlement. The first red flag appeared in the executive compensation section. Richard's salary had increased 340% over the past 3 years, far exceeding industry standards and well beyond what the board had officially approved. But more troubling were the consulting payments to something called Strategic Development Solutions, a company that had received $2.8 million over the past 18 months for services that were described in the vaguest possible terms. I opened my laptop and began researching Strategic Development Solutions, using the investigative skills I had developed during my years of secret business acquisitions. The company had been incorporated in Delaware 2 years ago, with registration documents that listed a P.O. box as its primary address. The corporate officers were listed as N. Kellaway and R. Hartwell. Natasha and Richard had created their own consulting firm and were billing Hartwell Industries for nearly $3 million in fabricated services. My hands trembled slightly as I continued reading through the financial documents, discovering layer after layer of questionable transactions. Equipment purchases from vendors that existed only on paper, real estate leases for properties that Hartwell Industries apparently rented but never occupied, travel expenses that included first-class flights to destinations that had no connection to any legitimate business purpose. But the most damaging discovery was buried in the merger and acquisition section of the quarterly report. 6 months ago, Richard had recommended that Hartwell Industries purchase a small manufacturing firm called Precision Components for $15 million. The acquisition had been presented to the board as a strategic move to expand our production capabilities, with projected returns that would justify the substantial investment. What the board hadn't known, what I was only discovering now, was that Precision Components was owned by a holding company controlled by Edward Kellaway, Natasha's father. I leaned back in my leather chair, staring at the documents spread across my mahogany desk, trying to process the magnitude of what I was uncovering. This wasn't just an affair between a middle-aged CEO and his young assistant. This was a coordinated financial conspiracy involving Natasha's family, designed to extract as much money as possible from Hartwell Industries while positioning Richard as the fall guy when the scheme inevitably collapsed. My phone rang, interrupting my analysis. The caller ID showed my daughter Catherine's number. "Mom, I've been thinking about Dad's call this morning," Catherine said without preamble. "Something about his tone bothered me. He seemed almost excited about the divorce, like he was looking forward to it." I considered how much to tell her. Catherine had always been perceptive, inheriting both my intuition and Richard's analytical mind. "What exactly did he say to you?" "He said you two had grown apart, and that he'd found someone who truly understood him. But then he started talking about new business opportunities, about finally being free to pursue ventures that had been, quote, constrained by previous obligations. Mom, it sounded like he was planning something." Catherine's words confirmed what the financial documents were suggesting. Richard hadn't just fallen in love with Natasha. He had been recruited into a scheme that used their relationship as cover for systematic corporate theft. "Catherine," I said carefully, "what do you know about your father's assistant?" "Natasha? She always seemed ambitious beyond her role. When I visited the office last Christmas, she was sitting in on strategic meetings, taking notes during conversations that should have been above her clearance level. I remember thinking it was odd that Dad was giving her so much access to sensitive information." I made notes on a legal pad as Catherine spoke, adding her observations to the growing evidence of a conspiracy that went far beyond a simple extramarital affair. "There's something else, Mom. Last month, Dad asked me some strange questions about your inheritance from grandmother. He wanted to know if you'd ever mentioned having investments he didn't know about, or if you'd talked about financial planning that didn't involve him." My blood ran cold. Richard had been investigating my finances, probably at Natasha's suggestion. They suspected I had hidden assets but hadn't discovered the extent of my secret business empire. "What did you tell him?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "The truth, that you never discussed your personal finances with me." "But Mom, the fact that he was asking suggests he's planning something that involves your money, not just his." After ending the call with Catherine, I returned to the financial documents with renewed focus. If Richard and Natasha suspected I had hidden assets, they might be planning to claim them in the divorce proceedings. But their investigation had missed the most crucial detail. I didn't just have money. I owned the company Richard thought he was stealing from. I pulled out my secure phone, a device I used exclusively for business communications that Richard knew nothing about, and called James Morrison, my attorney. "Victoria," James answered on the first ring. "I was expecting your call. Harold briefed me on tomorrow's board meeting." "James, we have a bigger problem than I initially realized." I spent the next 30 minutes walking him through my discoveries, reading directly from the financial documents that painted a picture of systematic embezzlement and conspiracy. "Jesus," James muttered when I finished. "This isn't just termination for cause anymore. This is criminal fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit theft. Victoria, Richard could be looking at federal charges." "What about Natasha and her father?" "If what you're telling me is accurate, they're looking at the same charges, possibly more. Using a romantic relationship to facilitate corporate theft adds additional complications under federal guidelines." I walked to my office window, looking out at the landscaped grounds that Richard assumed would soon be sold to fund his new life. In the distance, I could see the lights of downtown Millbrook, including the Hartwell Industries building where my husband was probably working late again, planning his next move in a game he didn't realize he had already lost. James, I want to give Richard one final opportunity to reconsider his choices. What do you mean? Tomorrow morning, before the board meeting, I'm going to call him. I'm going to offer him the chance to end the affair, return the stolen money, and attempt to salvage our marriage. James was quiet for a long moment. Victoria, given what you've discovered, why would you even consider reconciliation? Because I want him to understand exactly what he's choosing to give up. When he refuses, and he will refuse, I want there to be no question that he made his decision with full knowledge of the consequences. And if he surprises you and agrees? I considered this possibility, studying my reflection in the window glass. The woman looking back at me was no longer the supportive wife who had spent 40 years enabling her husband's career while building her own empire in secret. That woman had been betrayed once too often. He won't, I said finally. Richard has never backed down from a decision once he's convinced himself it's strategically sound. He believes he's trading an aging wife for a young lover and a comfortable retirement for unlimited wealth. He has no idea that he's actually trading everything for nothing. After hanging up with James, I spent another hour reviewing the board meeting agenda Harold had prepared. 6 board members would attend: myself, Harold, 2 other executives who had been loyal to the company for decades, and 2 outside directors who had been appointed based on my recommendations. Richard would arrive expecting to discuss quarterly projections and next year's expansion plans. Instead, he would face a motion for his immediate termination, followed by presentation of evidence documenting his theft and conspiracy. The board would vote, the outcome already predetermined by my controlling interest in the company. But before any of that happened, I would give him one last chance to choose differently. I locked the financial documents in my office safe and headed upstairs to our bedroom, my bedroom now, where I would spend one final night in the house I had shared with Richard for 25 years. Tomorrow would bring either his surrender or his destruction, but either way, it would mark the end of the life we had built together. As I prepared for bed, I thought about the woman I had been 40 years ago, young and trusting, willing to sacrifice my own ambitions to support the man I loved. That woman could never have imagined the night would come when she would orchestrate the systematic dismantling of her husband's entire existence. But that woman had never been betrayed by someone she trusted with everything. That woman had never discovered that her marriage was just another business transaction in someone else's long-term plan. Tomorrow, Richard would learn the cost of underestimating the woman who had loved him enough to let him believe he was in control. At 7:30 the following morning, I made the phone call that would determine whether Richard truly understood what he was about to lose. I sat in my kitchen with coffee growing cold in front of me, watching the sunrise paint our grounds in shades of gold, while I dialed the number of his hotel suite at the Grandview. "Victoria?" Richard's voice carried surprise and what might have been guilt. "Is everything all right?" "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," I said, keeping my tone carefully neutral. "I believe we should talk before you make any final decisions about our marriage." There was a pause, filled with the distant sound of a television news program and what sounded like someone moving around in the background. Natasha, presumably, getting ready for another day of stealing from the company she didn't realize belonged to me. "Victoria, I thought I was clear yesterday. I've already made my decision." "I understand that you believe you have," I replied, "but I don't think you fully comprehend what that decision entails. Richard, there are things about our financial situation that you don't know, things that might change your perspective." I could hear him moving, probably stepping away from wherever Natasha was listening. When he spoke again, his voice carried the patronizing tone he had perfected over decades of explaining business concepts to people he considered less sophisticated. "Victoria, I appreciate that you're concerned about your security, but I've already told you that you'll be taken care of. The lawyers will work out something fair." "That's not what I'm talking about, Richard. I'm talking about assets you don't know about, investments I made independently over the years, resources that could significantly change both of our situations if we were to remain married." The silence stretched longer this time. I could practically hear him calculating, weighing the possibility that I might have hidden wealth against his desire to pursue his new life with Natasha. "What kind of assets?" he asked finally. "The kind that should be discussed in person, not over the phone. Richard, I'm asking you to come home this morning. Before you go to the office, before you make any other commitments, just come home and let me show you what 40 years of marriage has actually been worth." Another pause, this one filled with muffled conversation. He was consulting with Natasha, I realized, asking for her input on whether my mysterious assets were worth investigating. "Victoria, if you have money that you've been hiding from me, that's something our lawyers can sort out during the divorce proceedings. It doesn't change the fundamental fact that our marriage is over." His words confirmed what I had already suspected. Natasha had coached him well. She understood that any hidden assets I possessed would become community property subject to division, which meant Richard's divorce settlement would be larger if I actually had secret wealth. The fact that he was refusing my offer to discuss it privately suggested either supreme confidence in his legal position or explicit instructions from someone who understood divorce law better than he did. "Richard," I said softly, "I'm offering you the chance to reconsider your decision with complete information. If you refuse, there won't be another opportunity." "Victoria, you're being dramatic. Whatever money you think you've hidden away, it's not going to change anything. I've made my choice, and I'm happy with it." After he hung up, I sat in my kitchen for several more minutes, processing the conversation and its implications. Richard had chosen Natasha and their scheme over any possibility of salvaging our marriage, even when faced with the prospect of significant hidden wealth. His refusal to even investigate what I might be offering confirmed that his decision wasn't driven by emotion alone. It was part of a calculated plan that required my removal from his life, regardless of the financial consequences. At 8:15, I called Catherine back. "Mom, you're up early." "Catherine, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to trust me without asking too many questions." "That sounds ominous. What's going on?" "I need you to contact your Uncle Michael and ask him to drive down from Seattle today. Tell him it's urgent family business, and that I'll explain everything when he arrives." Michael was my younger brother, a successful attorney who specialized in white-collar criminal defense. More importantly, he was someone who had never been impressed by Richard's charm and had always been suspicious of my husband's business practices. "Mom, you're scaring me. Are you in some kind of trouble?" "No, sweetheart. But Richard might be, and I want family here when everything comes out." After arranging for Michael's emergency trip to Millbrook, I called Rebecca Chen, my financial advisor and one of the only people who knew the full extent of my business empire. "Victoria, Harold filled me in on today's board meeting. Are you certain you want to proceed this dramatically?" "Rebecca, Richard just had the opportunity to step back from the precipice, and he chose to jump instead. At this point, I'm not saving him from consequences. I'm documenting that he chose them. The forensic accountants finished their preliminary review of the documents you provided. The theft is worse than we initially calculated. They've identified at least $8.2 million in fraudulent transactions over the past 3 years, with evidence suggesting the scheme goes back even further." I absorbed this information while reviewing my notes from the previous evening's investigation. $8 million stolen from my own company, funneled through fake businesses and bogus contracts while I played the role of the oblivious wife. "Rebecca, I want you at the board meeting today, not as my financial advisor, but as a witness to what happens next." "Of course." "Victoria, there's something else you should know. I had lunch yesterday with Patricia Holloway from First National Bank. Richard has been asking questions about getting a personal loan secured by his stake in Hartwell Industries. This was new information and deeply troubling. How large a loan? $25 million. He told Patricia he was planning a major acquisition that required immediate liquidity, something too time-sensitive for traditional corporate financing. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air coming through the kitchen windows. Richard wasn't just stealing from the company, he was planning to leverage his supposed ownership stake to borrow additional millions, probably to fund whatever new venture he and Natasha were planning. A $25 million loan that would be secured by stock he didn't actually own, creating a debt that would become my legal responsibility when the fraud was discovered. Patricia didn't approve the loan, obviously. But, Victoria, the fact that he's thinking in terms of $25 million suggests this conspiracy is much larger than we realized. At 8:45, I drove to the Hartwell Industries building, parking in the executive garage and taking the private elevator to the 42nd floor. The board meeting wouldn't begin for 15 minutes, but I wanted to be in the conference room when Richard arrived, wanted to see his face when he realized that something fundamental had changed. Harold was already there, along with Rebecca and James Morrison. The other board members, David Park, Jennifer Walsh, and Thomas Brennan, arrived within minutes, their expressions reflecting curiosity about the emergency meeting and concern about the serious tone of the agenda items Harold had provided. Before Richard arrives, I said, taking my seat at the head of the conference table, I want everyone to understand what we're dealing with today. This isn't just a personnel change or strategic reorganization. We're confronting systematic theft, fraud, and conspiracy that has cost this company millions of dollars. David Park, our longest-serving outside director, leaned forward with concern. Victoria, those are serious allegations. Do we have sufficient evidence to support them? James Morrison opened his briefcase and began distributing folders to each board member. What you're about to see represents just the preliminary findings of our investigation. The full scope of the fraud is still being determined. As the board members reviewed the evidence, I watched their expressions shift from skepticism to shock to anger. These were experienced business professionals who understood the implications of what they were seeing, the devastating impact on the company's financial stability and reputation. "My God," Jennifer Walsh whispered, studying the consulting payments to Strategic Development Solutions. "Richard set up his own company to bill us for non-existent services?" "Among other things," Harold confirmed grimly. "The Precision Components acquisition alone represents a $15 million payment to the defendant's family members for a company worth less than $3 million. At exactly 9 o'clock, Richard entered the conference room with his usual confident stride, dressed in his most expensive suit and carrying the leather portfolio he used for important meetings. His smile faltered slightly when he saw me sitting at the head of the table, the position he usually occupied, but he recovered quickly. "Good morning, everyone. Victoria, I didn't expect to see you here today." "Richard," I replied calmly, "please take a seat. We have quite a lot to discuss." Richard settled into the chair to my right, the same seat he had occupied for countless board meetings over the past 2 decades, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion as he noticed the tension in the room and the manila folders spread in front of each board member. "I have to say, this is unusual timing for a board meeting," he said, attempting his practiced executive charm. "I hope there isn't some crisis that requires immediate attention." "On the contrary," I replied, my voice steady and professional, "this meeting is long overdue. Harold, would you please begin with the financial overview?" Harold cleared his throat and opened his folder, his hands trembling slightly as he began to read. "The purpose of today's emergency session is to address serious irregularities in company finances that have come to light during our routine quarterly audit." Richard's eyebrows rose with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Irregularities? Harold, why wasn't I informed about any audit findings?" "Because," Jennifer Walsh interjected, her voice sharp with barely contained anger, "you are the subject of those findings, Richard." The color drained from Richard's face as he looked around the table, finally beginning to understand that this wasn't a routine business meeting. His gaze settled on me, and for the first time in our 40-year marriage, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. "I don't understand what's happening here," he said, his voice losing its earlier confidence. "Victoria, what is this about?" I opened my own folder and slid a document across the table to him. "This is about Strategic Development Solutions, Richard, the consulting company you and Natasha created to bill Hartwell Industries for $2.8 million in non-existent services." Richard stared at the incorporation papers, his name clearly visible alongside Natasha's as corporate officers. His mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak. There must be some mistake." Strategic Development Solutions is a legitimate consulting firm. They provided strategic planning services for our expansion initiatives. Really? Thomas Brennan, our outside director and former federal prosecutor, leaned forward with the expression I remembered from his courtroom days. Then perhaps you can explain why this legitimate consulting firm has never filed a tax return, maintains no business address beyond a post office box, and has no employees other than you and Miss Kellaway. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Richard's breathing, which had become noticeably heavier. He was scanning the faces around the table, looking for an ally, someone who might believe whatever explanation he was frantically constructing. Furthermore, Harold continued, consulting his notes, we've identified the Precision Components acquisition as fraudulent. The company you recommended we purchase for $15 million is owned by Edward Kellaway, Miss Kellaway's father, and has an actual market value of approximately $2.8 million. That's impossible, Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. I conducted thorough due diligence on Precision Components. The valuation was confirmed by independent appraisers. David Park slid another document across the table. These independent appraisers? Wilson and Associates? Their business license was revoked 3 years ago for filing false reports. The address listed on their letterhead is a defunct shopping center in Phoenix. I watched Richard's face as the full scope of his exposure became clear to him. This wasn't just about an extramarital affair anymore. This was about systematic fraud, documented theft, and conspiracy charges that could send him to federal prison. Victoria, he said, turning to me with an expression I had never seen before, desperation mixed with a dawning realization that his carefully constructed life was collapsing around him. You have to understand, this isn't what it looks like. These investments, these partnerships, they were all designed to benefit the company in the long term. Were they? I asked calmly, including the equipment purchases from vendors that don't exist, the real estate leases for properties that Hartwell Industries has never occupied, the travel expenses for trips to destinations that have no connection to any company business? Rebecca Chen, who had been silent until now, opened her laptop and turned it toward Richard. We've traced 47 separate fraudulent transactions over the past 3 years, totaling $8.2 million in diverted funds. Each transaction was authorized by you personally, using company accounts you believed you controlled. Richard stared at the screen displaying the forensic accounting analysis, his face pale and drawn. This is insane. You're all acting like I'm some kind of criminal. I built this company. Everything I've done has been for Hartwell Industries. Everything you've done, Thomas Brennan said quietly, has been for Richard Hartwell, and apparently for Natasha Kellaway and her family. At the mention of Natasha's name, Richard's expression hardened slightly, as if he was remembering coaching he had received for exactly this scenario. My personal relationship with Natasha has nothing to do with company business, and I resent the implication that your personal relationship, I interrupted, facilitated the systematic theft of millions of dollars from this company. Your personal relationship created the conflicts of interest that allowed you to approve fraudulent contracts and purchases. Your personal relationship made you complicit in a conspiracy that could destroy everything this company has built. Richard stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the conference room floor. I don't have to listen to these accusations. Victoria, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but I won't be railroaded by a board meeting orchestrated by a bitter wife who can't accept that her marriage is over. The silence that followed his outburst was profound. Every person in the room understood that Richard had just made the worst possible response to the evidence presented against him: denial, deflection, and personal attacks, rather than any attempt to explain or justify his actions. Richard, I said softly, please sit down. No, I'm calling my lawyer, and I'm calling Natasha to inform her that she's being unfairly targeted because of her relationship with me. This witch hunt ends now. He reached for his phone, but James Morrison spoke before Richard could dial. Mr. Hartwell, I should inform you that Miss Kellaway is currently in federal custody. She was arrested this morning on charges of wire fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering. The phone slipped from Richard's hands, clattering onto the conference table. That's impossible. Natasha is at her apartment. I spoke with her an hour ago. You spoke with her at 7:30 this morning, Rebecca confirmed, checking her notes. She was arrested at 8:15, shortly after she left the Grandview Hotel, where you've been staying. Richard collapsed back into his chair, the fight seeming to drain out of him as the implications became clear. If Natasha was in custody, she was either cooperating with authorities or would be soon. Everything they had planned together, every aspect of their conspiracy, would be exposed under federal investigation. This can't be happening, he whispered, more to himself than to anyone in the room. Richard, I said, leaning forward slightly, there's something else you need to understand about your situation, something that might change your perspective on exactly how much trouble you're facing. He looked up at me with hollow eyes, and I realized that some part of him already knew what I was about to reveal. Some instinct, perhaps, or maybe just the recognition that the woman he had dismissed as a naive housewife was orchestrating his downfall, with a sophistication that suggested resources and knowledge he had never suspected. The company you've been stealing from, I continued quietly, the assets you've been plundering, the stock you were planning to use as collateral for a $25 million loan, none of it belongs to you, Richard. His breathing stopped entirely as he stared at me across the conference table. For the past 15 years, I have owned 67% of Hartwell Industries. You've been the CEO of my company, stealing my money and planning to borrow against my assets to fund your new life with your co-conspirator. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and I watched 40 years of marriage, decades of partnership, and Richard's entire sense of identity crumble in the space of a single heartbeat. The silence in the conference room stretched for what felt like an eternity as Richard processed the magnitude of what I had just revealed. His face cycled through expressions of disbelief, confusion, and finally, a terrible understanding that everything he thought he knew about his life had been an illusion. "That's impossible," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I built this company. I started Hartwell Industries 23 years ago with my own capital, my own vision. You were just..." "Just what, Richard?" I asked, my tone remaining calm despite the emotion churning beneath the surface. "Just the supportive wife who attended your business dinners? Just the woman who entertained your clients while you closed deals? Just the pretty accessory who smiled and nodded while you explained how brilliant you were?" He stared at me as if seeing me for the first time, and perhaps he was. The woman he had married 40 years ago, the one who had deferred to his judgment and subordinated her own ambitions to his career, had never existed except in his imagination. "Harold," I said, turning to our CFO, "would you please provide Mr. Hartwell with a copy of the corporate structure documents?" Harold slid a thick folder across the table to Richard, who opened it with trembling hands. Inside were incorporation papers, stock transfer agreements, and board resolutions dating back 15 years, all documenting the gradual acquisition of Hartwell Industries by a series of shell companies ultimately controlled by me. "This started," I explained, watching Richard's eyes scan the documents, "with my grandmother's inheritance. You remember, Richard, that modest sum you always dismissed as household money? It was actually $3.2 million invested in a trust fund that you never bothered to investigate because you assumed any money I had was insignificant compared to your business empire." Rebecca Chen opened her laptop and projected a timeline onto the conference room screen. Mrs. Hartwell began acquiring shares in Hartwell Industries incrementally starting in 2008, during the financial crisis when the company's stock price was depressed. The acquisitions were structured through multiple holding companies to avoid disclosure requirements. Richard looked up from the documents, his face ashen. 2008? But that was when we almost lost everything, when I thought we might have to declare bankruptcy. You almost lost everything, I corrected. I was busy saving it. While you were panicking about cash flow and considering layoffs, I was quietly purchasing company stock from investors who were desperate to sell. When you celebrated our quote, miraculous recovery in 2009, you were actually celebrating my investment in your company. The board members watched this exchange with fascination, finally understanding the true power dynamics that had shaped Hartwell Industries for over a decade. Jennifer Walsh leaned forward, clearly impressed despite the gravity of the situation. Victoria, you've been the majority shareholder for 15 years, and Richard never knew? Richard never bothered to look beyond the surface, I replied. He saw board meetings as formalities, where his decisions would be rubber-stamped. He never questioned why certain strategic initiatives always seemed to receive unanimous approval, or why the company survived financial crises that destroyed our competitors. Thomas Brennan, still reviewing the legal documents, looked up with professional admiration. This acquisition strategy was brilliant. By spreading the purchases across multiple entities and timing them during market downturns, you avoided triggering disclosure requirements while accumulating control. Richard's hands were shaking as he turned pages in the folder, encountering document after document that proved his life's work had actually belonged to someone else. But the initial capital, I started this company with my own money, my inheritance from my father. Your inheritance was $400,000, Richard. Hardly enough to build a manufacturing empire. I pulled out another file and placed it in front of him. The additional startup capital, the money that actually made Hartwell Industries possible, came from my trust fund. I've been your silent partner from the very beginning. David Park was studying the financial projections Rebecca had displayed. Victoria, the returns on these investments are extraordinary. You essentially turned a $3.2 million inheritance into a company worth over $200 million. More than that, Rebecca confirmed. Current valuation, even accounting for the stolen funds, is approximately $285 million. Mrs. Hartwell's 67% stake is worth just over $190 million. Richard made a choking sound, as if the numbers were physically painful to hear. $190 million that he had believed belonged to him, that he had been planning to leverage for his new life with Natasha, that had never been his at all. Why? He asked, looking directly at me for the first time since the meeting began. Why didn't you tell me? Why let me believe I was building something when you were the one with the real power? The question hung in the air, laden with 40 years of assumptions and misunderstandings. I considered my answer carefully, wanting to be honest about motivations that had evolved over the decades. Initially, it was love, I said simply. I wanted you to succeed, to feel proud of your accomplishments. I thought I was being a good wife by supporting your career without overshadowing it with my own contributions. And later? Jennifer Walsh asked gently. Later, it became protection. I watched how you treated business partners who challenged your authority, how you discarded people who were no longer useful to you. I realized that if you knew the truth about the company's ownership, you might view me as a threat rather than an asset. Richard's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. So you decided to manipulate me instead, to let me live a lie for 15 years? I decided to protect my investment, I replied coolly, which, given your recent activities, was clearly the right decision. If you had known you were CEO of my company rather than owner of your own, would you have been less likely to steal from it? The question silenced him because we both knew the answer. Richard had always been ruthless in pursuing what he wanted, whether in business or personal relationships. The only thing that had restrained him was his belief that he was stealing from himself, a logical impossibility that should have made his recent actions unthinkable. James Morrison cleared his throat and addressed the room. Given these revelations about ownership structure, the board needs to consider its next steps. Mr. Hartwell faces serious criminal charges, but there are also corporate governance issues that require immediate attention. Harold nodded and consulted his notes. The company's reputation will be severely damaged when news of the fraud becomes public. We need a transition plan that protects our employees and business relationships. There's something else, Rebecca added, pulling up another document on her laptop. The forensic accountants discovered that Mr. Hartwell has been using company resources to investigate Mrs. Hartwell's personal finances. He hired a private investigator to look into her banking records and investment activities. This was news to me, and I felt a chill of anger at the violation of privacy. What did this investigation reveal? Very little, fortunately. Your financial activities were too well protected for amateur investigation. But the invoices suggest he suspected you had hidden assets and was trying to locate them, probably for divorce proceedings. Richard's continued silence spoke volumes. Even now, faced with complete exposure of his crimes, he couldn't bring himself to admit the scope of his betrayal or show genuine remorse for his actions. The irony, I said, looking directly at him, is that if you had simply been honest with me about your unhappiness, if you had asked for a divorce without the lies and theft, you might have received a generous settlement. Even as the wronged party, I would have ensured you were financially secure. And now? David Park asked. I turned to address the full board, my voice steady and authoritative. Now we vote on a motion to terminate Richard Hartwell for cause, effective immediately, with forfeiture of all benefits and stock options. We also vote to authorize full cooperation with federal authorities in their criminal investigation. Richard finally found his voice again. Victoria, please. We were married for 40 years. That has to count for something. I met his gaze across the conference table, seeing not the powerful CEO who had dominated boardrooms for decades, but a broken man who had gambled everything on a scheme that was doomed from the start. It does count for something, Richard. It counts as 40 years of trust that you chose to destroy for a woman young enough to be your daughter and a few $1 million that were never yours to take. The vote was swift and unanimous. Richard Hartwell was terminated as CEO and president of Hartwell Industries, effective immediately with cause. As each board member voiced their decision, I watched my husband of 40 years shrink further into his chair, the reality of his complete destruction settling over him like a suffocating blanket. But as the meeting concluded and board members began filing out, expressing their support and promising discretion until public announcements could be properly managed, James Morrison received a phone call that would reveal the true depths of the conspiracy Richard had entangled himself in. That was Assistant U.S. Attorney Patricia Valdez, James said, hanging up his phone with a grim expression. Victoria, we need to discuss some developments in the federal investigation that affect you directly. Richard, who had been sitting in stunned silence, looked up with what might have been hope flickering in his eyes. Perhaps he thought the government's involvement would somehow validate his actions or provide him with leverage against me. What kind of developments? I asked, though something in James's tone suggested I wouldn't like the answer. Natasha Kellaway has been cooperating with federal authorities since her arrest this morning. According to her statement, the conspiracy was significantly more complex than we realized. James paused, glancing at Richard before continuing. Victoria, she claims that you were the intended target of an elaborate long-term fraud scheme designed to steal your inheritance and secret investments. The words hit me like a physical blow. What do you mean, intended target? Rebecca Chen, who had been gathering her materials, stopped and turned back to the conference table. Are you saying Richard knew about Victoria's ownership all along? According to Natasha's statement, Richard has known about Victoria's majority stake in Hartwell Industries for at least 3 years. The affair, the embezzlement, even the divorce announcement, all of it was orchestrated to position him to claim the company in divorce proceedings. I felt the world tilt around me as the implications became clear. Richard's sudden desire for divorce, his casual dismissal of our 40-year marriage, his confidence about maintaining his lifestyle despite supposedly giving up half of everything. It all made terrible sense if he had known about my ownership and planned to claim it as community property. That's impossible, I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I was remembering conversations and incidents that suddenly took on new meaning. Richard, tell them that's not true. But Richard wouldn't meet my eyes. Instead, he stared at his hands folded on the conference table, his silence more damning than any confession. There's more, James continued reluctantly. Natasha claims that her father, Edward Kellaway, is a convicted financial criminal who served 8 years in federal prison for orchestrating Ponzi schemes targeting wealthy women. According to her statement, this entire situation was his idea, a way to identify and exploit women with hidden assets. The room seemed to spin as I processed this information. The affair hadn't been a midlife crisis or even simple greed. It had been a predatory scheme targeting me specifically because someone had identified me as a woman with secret wealth. How did they know? I whispered. How did they find out about my investments? Rebecca was already pulling up information on her laptop. I'm checking our security protocols now. Victoria, do you remember Richard asking unusual questions about your inheritance or investment activities? I thought back over the past few years, searching for clues I had missed. Last year, he suggested we should consolidate our financial accounts for tax purposes. He wanted me to provide him with statements from all my personal accounts. I told him it wasn't necessary. What else? James pressed. He asked about my grandmother's jewelry, whether there were pieces that might have significant value that we should have appraised for insurance purposes. And I paused, remembering something that had seemed innocent at the time. He arranged for a complete security system upgrade for our house last year. The installer spent hours setting up monitoring equipment. Harold Kingsley, who had remained silent throughout these revelations, suddenly looked up from his phone. Victoria, I just received a message from building security. Richard's been accessing the corporate offices at unusual hours for the past 6 months, including weekends and holidays when he claimed to be traveling for business. The pieces were falling into place, creating a picture of surveillance and systematic investigation that went far beyond a simple extramarital affair. Richard and his conspirators had been studying me, learning my habits, identifying my vulnerabilities, and planning an attack on everything I had built. The $25 million loan application, I said suddenly, understanding flooding through me. He wasn't planning to use that money for a new business venture. He was planning to extract as much cash as possible before the divorce, knowing that community property laws would make me responsible for the debt. Thomas Brennan nodded grimly. If the divorce had proceeded normally, you would have been forced to sell your stake in Hartwell Industries to pay off debt that Richard had incurred. Even if you retained ownership, the company would have been financially crippled. And they would have disappeared, Rebecca added, leaving you with a worthless company and massive personal liability. I turned to look at Richard, who had been my partner for 4 decades, the father of my daughter, the man I had loved enough to sacrifice my own ambitions to support his career. How long, Richard? How long have you been planning to destroy me? Finally, he raised his head and met my gaze. What I saw there wasn't the remorse or shame I might have expected, but something closer to resentment. You kept secrets for 15 years, Victoria. You let me believe I was building something when you were the one with the real power. Did you think I was stupid? Did you think I would never figure it out? So you decided to steal from me instead of talking to me? I decided to take what should have been mine from the beginning. The words exploded out of him with a fury that revealed the depth of his anger and entitlement. I gave you 40 years of my life, 40 years of supporting you and providing for you, and all along you were sitting on a fortune that could have changed everything. I was supporting you, Richard. I was protecting both of us. You were controlling me. He stood up, his face flushed with rage. Every decision I made, every strategy I implemented, every success I celebrated, all of it was because you allowed it to happen. I was never actually in charge of anything. The revelation of his true feelings cut deeper than the affair, or even the embezzlement. For 3 years, he had nursed this resentment, this sense of emasculation at discovering that his wife possessed power he couldn't control. Rather than confronting me honestly or asking to be included in my financial planning, He had chosen to align himself with criminals who promised to help him reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. "So you brought in Edward Kellaway," I said quietly, "a convicted fraud specialist who identified me as a target. Edward understands how the world really works. He showed me that I didn't have to accept being your employee for the rest of my life." James Morrison was taking notes rapidly, documenting Richard's admissions for the prosecutors, who would inevitably use his words against him. But I barely noticed, focused entirely on the man across from me who had just revealed that our entire marriage had been redefined in his mind as a power struggle rather than a partnership. The house surveillance, the private investigators, the financial planning. You were building a case against me. I was gathering information about assets that should have been community property from the beginning. Edward's lawyer said that your secret investments could be considered fraudulent concealment in divorce proceedings. And if I had discovered what you were doing? Richard's silence stretched for several seconds before he answered, and when he did, his words chilled me to the bone. Edward said that wouldn't be a problem, that there were ways to ensure compliance from uncooperative partners. The threat was unmistakable, and I realized that my physical safety had been at risk in ways I had never imagined. This wasn't just financial fraud. It was a conspiracy that might have escalated to kidnapping, coercion, or worse if their original plan had been discovered. Rebecca was already on her phone, presumably contacting security services and law enforcement. Thomas Brennan was making his own calls, likely to federal prosecutors who needed to understand the full scope of the conspiracy they were investigating. But I sat in my chair, staring at the man I had shared my life with for 40 years, understanding finally that he had become someone I never knew, someone capable of threats and violence against the woman who had loved him enough to build him an empire. The implications of Richard's veiled threat hung in the air like a toxic cloud as I processed the full scope of what he and his conspirators had been planning. But instead of the fear they had undoubtedly hoped to instill, I felt something else entirely, a crystalline clarity that burned away any remaining sentiment about our marriage and replaced it with cold, strategic determination. "Rebecca," I said, my voice steady despite the emotional turmoil churning beneath the surface, "I want you to contact our head of security immediately. I need a complete analysis of every system Richard had installed in our home, every piece of equipment, every monitoring device. I want to know exactly what they've been recording and for how long." "Already on it," Rebecca replied, her fingers flying across her phone screen. "I'm also arranging for a security team to sweep your house and install countermeasures." James Morrison was coordinating with federal prosecutors, sharing Richard's admissions and the new information about Edward Kellaway's criminal background. But I was focused on something else entirely, the sudden realization that I had been playing defense for too long, reacting to their moves instead of dictating the terms of engagement. "Harold," I said, turning to our CFO, "I want you to freeze all company credit cards, expense accounts, and petty cash funds that Richard had access to. Also, change every password, every security code, and every access protocol he might have known. I want him completely locked out of all company systems within the hour." Harold nodded vigorously, already making notes on his tablet. "What about his company car and the corporate apartment downtown?" "Secure both immediately. Have security retrieve the car from wherever he parked it and change the locks on the apartment. Any personal belongings can be boxed and delivered to his hotel." Richard watched these rapid-fire instructions with growing alarm, finally understanding that his admission of threats had fundamentally changed his situation. "Victoria, you can't just—" "I can do whatever I want, Richard," I interrupted, my voice cutting through his protest like a blade. "It's my company, remember? Every privilege you've enjoyed, every benefit you've taken for granted, every luxury you've assumed was yours by right, all of it came from my generosity. And as of right now, that generosity is officially exhausted." Thomas Brennan, who had been listening to my instructions with professional interest, leaned forward. "Victoria, given what we've learned about the conspiracy and the potential threats, I strongly recommend that you consider personal protection services." Edward Kellaway's criminal history suggests he's not above using intimidation or violence when his schemes are threatened. The suggestion sent a chill through me, but I forced myself to think strategically rather than emotionally. If Edward Kellaway was a career criminal who specialized in targeting wealthy women, and if his scheme to steal my fortune was collapsing, then desperate measures weren't just possible, they were probable. "Jennifer," I said, addressing our board member who had connections throughout the security industry, "can you recommend a firm that handles executive protection? I want professionals, not just bodyguards." "Absolutely. I'll have someone here within 2 hours." She was already scrolling through her contacts. "These are people who've protected Fortune 500 CEOs during hostile takeovers and federal investigations. They know how to handle complex threat scenarios." As board members and advisors coordinated security measures and legal strategies around me, I found myself studying Richard with new eyes. The man sitting across from me bore little resemblance to the husband I had loved for 4 decades. That man had been confident but fair, ambitious but principled, successful but grounded in basic decency. The person I was looking at now was a stranger, someone capable of surveillance, betrayal, theft, and implied violence against the woman who had devoted her life to supporting him. "There's something I need to understand," I said, my voice cutting through the conversations around us. The room fell silent as everyone turned to listen. "Richard, at what point did you decide that I was your enemy rather than your partner?" He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his response, calculating whether honesty or continued deception would serve him better. Finally, he chose a path that revealed more about his character than any elaborate explanation could have. "The day I realized you had been lying to me for 15 years about owning my company." "Your company?" I repeated, incredulous. "Richard, I showed you the documents. I provided the initial capital. I've been the majority shareholder since the beginning." "Capital that you hid from me. Investments you made without my knowledge. Decisions you made about my life's work without even consulting me." His voice rose with each accusation, and I could see the rage that had been building for 3 years finally erupting. "Do you have any idea what it's like to discover that everything you've built, everything you've achieved, exists only because your wife allowed it to happen?" The question hung in the air, revealing the fundamental difference in how we had viewed our marriage. Where I had seen partnership and mutual support, Richard had seen control and emasculation. Where I had seen love expressed through financial sacrifice, he had seen manipulation and deception. "Richard," I said quietly, "I never prevented you from building anything. I helped you build everything. The only difference is that I protected our foundation while you focused on the superstructure. Protected it by lying to me about it. Protected it because I knew that if you controlled everything, you would eventually gamble it all away." I gestured to the documents scattered across the conference table. "And I was right, wasn't I? The moment you thought you had leverage over me, you started stealing. The moment you believed you had found a better partner, you began planning to destroy me financially." The truth of this observation seemed to hit him physically, and he slumped back in his chair. But instead of accepting responsibility for his choices, he doubled down on his resentment. "Natasha understood me in ways that you never did. She saw my potential, my vision for what we could accomplish together. Natasha saw your bank account and your access to company funds," Rebecca interjected dryly. "Her understanding was directly proportional to how much money you could steal for her family's operation." "That's not true," Richard insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "Edward showed me opportunities that—" "Edward showed you how to rationalize theft," Thomas Brennan interrupted. "He's a career criminal, Richard. His specialty is convincing successful people that they deserve more than they have, and that taking it from others is somehow justified." I watched Richard grapple with the possibility that he had been manipulated as expertly as he had tried to manipulate me. The idea that Natasha's affection might have been calculated, that Edward's friendship might have been strategic, that his entire rebellion against our marriage might have been orchestrated by professionals who saw him as a useful tool rather than a partner. "It doesn't matter now," I said, standing up from the conference table with a finality that surprised even me. "What matters is that I'm done being victimized by people who mistake kindness for weakness and discretion for vulnerability." I turned to address the full room, my voice carrying the authority that came with actual ownership rather than delegated responsibility. "Ladies and gentlemen, Hartwell Industries is about to face the most challenging period in its history. We have federal investigations, media scrutiny, and the need to rebuild trust with our clients and employees. But we also have something our competitors don't: the truth." Harold looked up from his tablet, where he had been documenting security changes. "What's our public position going to be?" "Complete transparency," I replied without hesitation. "We're going to cooperate fully with federal authorities, implement the most stringent financial controls in our industry, and demonstrate that we're committed to emerging from this scandal stronger and more ethical than before." "And Richard?" Jennifer asked. I looked down at my former husband, who appeared to have aged a decade in the span of our conversation. "Richard made his choice when he decided to steal from this company and threaten its owner. Now he gets to live with the consequences of that choice." "Victoria," Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we were married for 40 years. That has to count for something." "It does count, Richard. It counts as 40 years of evidence that I'm capable of loyalty, discretion, and forgiveness. Qualities you chose to exploit rather than appreciate. It also counts as 40 years of proof that I don't make important decisions impulsively." I gathered my files and headed toward the conference room door, pausing only to deliver my final words to the man who had shared my life for 4 decades. "You had every opportunity to build a partnership with me based on honesty and mutual respect. Instead, you chose to build a conspiracy based on deception and theft. You get exactly what you chose, Richard. Nothing more, and certainly nothing less." Within 72 hours of the board meeting that ended Richard's career, I had transformed from a betrayed wife hiding in the shadows to the visible leader of a coordinated campaign that would not only recover every stolen dollar, but ensure that everyone involved in the conspiracy faced the full consequences of their actions. The first phase of my counterattack began with a call to Catherine, who had flown in from Portland despite my initial protests. She sat across from me in my home office, now swept clean of surveillance equipment and secured by a team of professionals who had found recording devices in places I never would have suspected. "Mom, I still can't believe Dad was capable of this," Catherine said, reviewing the documents I had shared with her. "I knew something was off when he called me about the divorce, but I never imagined anything like this." "I don't think your father imagined it either," initially I replied, studying the forensic accounting reports that had arrived that morning. "I believe he was recruited gradually, probably over months or even years. Edward Kellaway is a professional manipulator who specializes in identifying people with access to wealth and convincing them they deserve more than they have." Catherine nodded, her expression mixing sadness with determination. "What do you need me to do?" "I need you to help me send a message to everyone who might be considering similar schemes. We're not just going to recover our losses and move on quietly. We're going to make this case a cautionary tale that follows them for the rest of their lives." My daughter smiled, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw her father's strategic mind working in service of justice rather than greed. "I like the sound of that. What's the plan?" I had spent the previous evening crafting a comprehensive strategy that would operate on multiple fronts simultaneously. The beauty of having resources that Richard had never known about was that I could afford to pursue every avenue of justice without worrying about the cost. First, we're hiring the best private investigation firm on the East Coast to trace every transaction, every communication, and every connection between Richard, Natasha, and Edward Kellaway. The federal investigation is focused on criminal charges, but I want to understand the complete scope of their operation. "What about other victims?" Catherine asked. "If this Edward Kellaway has done this before, There are probably other women who've been targeted. Exactly. Which brings me to the second phase. I'm funding a victim advocacy organization that will help other women who've been targeted by romance fraud and financial manipulation schemes. Every dollar we recover above our actual losses will go toward preventing this from happening to someone else. Rebecca Chen arrived just after noon with updates from the financial front. Victoria, the asset recovery is proceeding faster than expected. We've identified 14 separate accounts where stolen funds were deposited, and the federal seizure orders have frozen over $6 million so far. What about the offshore accounts? I asked. Those are more complicated, but we have cooperation agreements with banks in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. Edward Kellaway apparently wasn't as sophisticated as he thought. Most of his financial structures are easily penetrated once you have federal court orders. Catherine whistled softly as she reviewed Rebecca's reports. Mom, they really thought they could steal from you and disappear with the money? They underestimated both my resources and my determination, I replied. But more importantly, they underestimated the legal system's ability to track financial crimes in the digital age. My phone rang with a call from James Morrison, who had news from the prosecution front. Victoria, I just spoke with U.S. Attorney Valdez. Natasha Kellaway's cooperation has been more extensive than initially expected. She's provided documentation of similar schemes, targeting at least 12 other women over the past 7 years. This information confirmed my suspicions about the scope of Edward Kellaway's operation. Have the other victims been contacted? That's where it gets interesting. Several of them are prepared to testify, but 3 others want to remain anonymous and are considering civil lawsuits. The prosecutor thinks your case could be the catalyst for a much larger investigation into organized romance fraud. I felt a grim satisfaction knowing that our situation might prevent other women from experiencing the same betrayal. What about Richard's legal situation? He's hired a defense attorney, but his position is virtually hopeless. Between Natasha's testimony, the financial evidence, and his own admissions during the board meeting, he's looking at multiple felony convictions and significant prison time. After James hung up, I turned to Catherine with a question that had been weighing on me since the board meeting. Do you think I'm being too harsh with your father? Some people might say that 40 years of marriage should count for something. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, studying her hands before meeting my eyes. Mom, can I tell you something I've never mentioned before? I nodded, sensing that whatever she was about to reveal would be significant. 3 years ago, when I was going through my divorce from Marcus, Dad offered to help me financially restructure the settlement. He said he knew ways to hide assets that Marcus's lawyers would never find, and that successful people had to protect themselves from those who would take advantage of their generosity. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. He offered to help you commit fraud? I thought he was just being protective, maybe suggesting legitimate tax strategies. But looking back on it now, with everything we know, Catherine shook her head. I think he was already deep into this mindset where taking money from people who trusted you was just smart business. This new information added another layer to Richard's betrayal. He hadn't just stolen from me. He had tried to corrupt our daughter, to turn her into someone who would rationalize theft and deception as necessary survival skills. Did you take his advice? I asked, though Catherine's character suggested I already knew the answer. No. It felt wrong, even when he explained it as protecting myself from an unfair system. I handled my divorce honestly, even though it cost me more than Dad's approach would have. I felt a surge of pride in my daughter's integrity, and relief that Richard's influence hadn't compromised her moral compass. But I also felt renewed determination to ensure that his crimes were exposed fully, not just for my sake, but for Catherine's, and for every other person he might have influenced or victimized. That settles it, I said, reaching for my phone. Rebecca, I want you to contact the media relations firm we discussed. It's time to go public with this story. Are you sure? Rebecca asked. Once this becomes public knowledge, there's no controlling the narrative. Good. I want everyone to know exactly what happened here. I want Richard's name associated with fraud and betrayal every time someone searches for him online. I want Natasha and Edward Kellaway to be unemployable in any industry that requires trust. And I want other potential victims to recognize the warning signs before they're targeted." Catherine smiled approvingly. "You're not just fighting back, Mom. You're making sure they can never do this to anyone else." Over the next several hours, I coordinated with communications professionals to craft a public statement that would expose the conspiracy while protecting the ongoing federal investigation. The statement would be released simultaneously to financial news outlets, local media, and industry publications, ensuring maximum coverage of Richard's downfall. The private investigation firm I had hired called with their first report, confirming that the Kellaway operation had been more extensive than even federal prosecutors realized. They had identified potential victims in 8 states, and evidence of coordination with similar schemes internationally. "Mrs. Hartwell," the lead investigator explained, "your case appears to be the one that broke their operation wide open. Your resources and determination to fight back gave law enforcement the tools they needed to see the bigger picture." As evening approached and the machinery of justice continued grinding forward on multiple fronts, I found myself reflecting on the transformation I had undergone in just a few days. The woman who had maintained secrets to preserve her marriage had become someone willing to expose everything to ensure accountability. Richard had calculated that I would be devastated by his betrayal, that I would quietly accept whatever settlement he offered rather than face the humiliation of public exposure. Instead, his betrayal had revealed strength I hadn't known I possessed and a determination to protect others that went far beyond personal vindication. Tomorrow, the world would learn the truth about Richard Hartwell and his co-conspirators. But tonight, I was simply a woman who had discovered that fighting back felt infinitely better than hiding in the shadows. The day of reckoning arrived 6 weeks after the board meeting that had destroyed Richard's career, and it came in the form of a federal courthouse packed with media, victims, and law enforcement officials who had spent months building an airtight case against what prosecutors were calling, quote, "one of the most sophisticated romance fraud operations in recent history." I sat in the front row of the courtroom, flanked by Catherine and my brother Michael, who had flown in from Seattle to witness Richard's sentencing. Behind us, 12 other women filled the gallery, victims of Edward Kellaway's various schemes who had found the courage to come forward after our story became public. The media attention had been intense, but ultimately beneficial. Within days of our press release, investigative journalists had uncovered additional details about the Kellaway family's criminal enterprise, and federal agents had arrested accomplices in 4 other states. The story had become a case study in how predators target successful women, and my decision to fight back publicly had inspired other victims to seek justice. Richard entered the courtroom in a gray prison jumpsuit, his wrists shackled, and his face bearing the hollow expression of a man who had finally grasped the magnitude of his downfall. The transformation was startling. Gone was the confident executive who had commanded boardrooms and charmed investors. In his place was a broken individual who looked older than his 73 years. Our eyes met briefly across the courtroom, and I felt nothing resembling the love or partnership that had defined our relationship for 4 decades. Instead, I saw a stranger who had chosen greed over loyalty, deception over honesty, and criminal conspiracy over the marriage we had built together. Judge Patricia Hawthorne, a stern woman in her 60s with a reputation for harsh sentences in financial fraud cases, called the court to order. "We are here today for the sentencing of Richard James Hartwell, who has pleaded guilty to charges of wire fraud, conspiracy to commit theft, money laundering, and organized financial crime." The prosecution's victim impact statements began with my own testimony, carefully crafted with James Morrison to focus on the systematic nature of Richard's betrayal rather than the personal pain it had caused. "Your Honor," I said, standing at the lectern with notes I ultimately didn't need, "Richard Hartwell didn't just steal money from my company. He stole 15 years of trust, 40 years of partnership, and the financial security of multiple families who believed they were working with an honest businessman." I gestured toward the other victims in the gallery. The women seated behind me represent just a fraction of the people whose lives were damaged by the conspiracy that Richard chose to join. These crimes weren't committed in a moment of weakness or desperation. They were the result of years of planning, calculation, and deliberate deception. Judge Hawthorne nodded as I continued. Richard had every advantage: education, opportunity, a loving family, and access to legitimate wealth through our marriage. He chose crime anyway, not because he needed money, but because he wanted more than he could earn honestly. That choice should have consequences that reflect the seriousness of what he's done. When I returned to my seat, other victims took the lectern to describe how Edward Kellaway's operation had destroyed their marriages, bankrupted their businesses, and left them questioning their ability to trust anyone. The cumulative impact was devastating, painting a picture of systematic predation that went far beyond simple theft. The defense attorney, an expensive hire who had been recommended by Richard's former golf partners, attempted to portray his client as a victim of manipulation by the Kellaway family. Your Honor, Mr. Hartwell was a respected businessman who fell prey to sophisticated criminals who exploited his personal vulnerabilities during a difficult period in his marriage. The argument was unconvincing, particularly given the evidence of Richard's active participation in planning and executing the fraud. Phone records showed hundreds of calls between Richard and Edward Kellaway over a 3-year period, many occurring during hours when Richard had told me he was working late at the office. Mr. Hartwell wasn't deceived by the Kellaway operation, Assistant U.S. Attorney Patricia Valdez responded during the prosecution's rebuttal. He was recruited by it. The evidence shows that he participated enthusiastically in planning how to extract maximum value from his wife's assets while avoiding detection. When Richard was given the opportunity to make a statement on his own behalf, he stood slowly and faced the judge. His voice was barely audible as he began to speak. Your Honor, I want to apologize to my wife, my daughter, and everyone who was hurt by my actions. I know that what I did was wrong, and I accept full responsibility for the choices I made. The words sounded rehearsed, lacking any genuine emotion or understanding of the devastation he had caused, but it was his next statement that revealed the depth of his continued self-deception. I also want the court to understand that I never intended for anyone to be permanently harmed by these activities. I believed that the investments and business arrangements we were pursuing would ultimately benefit everyone involved, including my wife and the company. Catherine shifted uncomfortably beside me as Richard continued this fantasy. Even now, facing federal sentencing, he couldn't admit that his actions had been driven by greed and resentment, rather than some misguided attempt to help anyone. Judge Hawthorne's expression hardened as Richard concluded his statement. Mr. Hartwell, the court has reviewed extensive evidence about your activities over the past 3 years. This was not a well-intentioned business arrangement that went wrong. This was a calculated conspiracy to defraud your wife and steal from the company she owned. The judge consulted her notes before continuing. The pre-sentence investigation reveals that you actively participated in surveillance of your wife, attempted to manipulate legal proceedings through false documentation, and conspired with known criminals to conceal assets stolen from multiple victims. Richard's shoulders sagged as the weight of the evidence settled over him again. There would be no sympathetic interpretation of his actions, no mitigation based on his age or previous good reputation. Furthermore, Judge Hawthorne added, your lack of genuine remorse, as evidenced by your continued attempts to justify criminal behavior as legitimate business activity, suggests that you remain a threat to potential future victims. The sentence, when it came, exceeded even the prosecution's recommendations. Richard James Hartwell, I hereby sentence you to 18 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. You are ordered to pay full restitution to all identified victims, totaling $12.7 million, plus court costs and investigative expenses. The gavel fell with a finality that echoed through the packed courtroom. 18 years meant that Richard would be 91 years old before he could even apply for parole, effectively a life sentence for a man his age. As the bailiffs approached to escort Richard back to his holding cell, he turned toward our section of the gallery one final time. His eyes found mine across the crowded courtroom, and I saw in them something I had never expected to see from the man I had married: hatred. Not regret for the choices he had made, not sorrow for the pain he had caused, but actual hatred for the woman whose trust he had violated and whose resources he had stolen. In that moment, I understood finally and completely that the man I had loved had never really existed, at least not in the way I had believed. Catherine took my hand as Richard disappeared through the courthouse door, probably for the last time either of us would ever see him. "Mom, are you okay?" I considered the question carefully, testing my emotional response to this final chapter of our 40-year marriage. "You know what, Catherine? I really am. For the first time since this nightmare began, I feel like justice has actually been served." Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered around the steps where I had agreed to make a brief statement. The cameras captured me, standing between Catherine and the other victims, presenting a united front of women who had refused to be silenced by financial predators. "Today's sentences send a clear message," I said, looking directly into the cameras. "Women with resources will not be intimidated, manipulated, or victimized without consequences. We will fight back, we will seek justice, and we will protect others from experiencing what we endured." As we walked toward the car that would take us away from this courthouse and this chapter of our lives, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: genuine optimism about the future. 1 year after Richard's sentencing, I stood in the executive boardroom of Hartwell Industries, now officially renamed Victoria Industries to reflect its true ownership, reviewing quarterly reports that showed the company had not only survived the scandal, but emerged stronger and more profitable than ever before. The transformation had been remarkable to witness. What could have been a devastating blow to our reputation had instead become a powerful story of resilience and ethical leadership that attracted new clients who specifically wanted to work with a company that had proven its commitment to transparency and accountability. "The numbers are extraordinary," Harold Kingsley said, his voice filled with pride as he presented the financial summary to our expanded board of directors. "Revenue is up 43% from last year. We've hired 67 new employees, and our client retention rate is the highest in company history." Jennifer Walsh, now serving as our Chief Operating Officer after accepting my offer to join the company full-time, nodded approvingly. "The ethics certification program we implemented has become a model for other firms in our industry. We're receiving consulting requests from companies that want to establish similar transparency standards." The irony wasn't lost on me that Richard's crimes had ultimately enhanced our business prospects rather than destroying them. By confronting the fraud publicly and implementing comprehensive reforms, we had differentiated ourselves in an industry where trust was paramount, and scandals were often covered up rather than addressed. But the most satisfying transformation wasn't financial, it was personal. The woman sitting at the head of this conference table bore little resemblance to the one who had hidden her business acumen behind a facade of supportive wife for 4 decades. I had discovered strengths I never knew I possessed, and confidence that came from proving myself in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. "There's something else," Rebecca Chen announced, consulting her tablet with a smile that suggested good news. "The Victoria Hartwell Foundation has distributed its first round of grants. 12 organizations focused on financial abuse prevention and victim advocacy have received funding totaling $2.8 million. The foundation had been my way of ensuring that something positive emerged from the disaster Richard had created. Using the recovered stolen funds plus contributions from my personal wealth, we were helping other women recognize and escape financial manipulation before it destroyed their lives." Catherine, who had relocated to Millbrook to help manage the foundation while expanding her own business, looked up from her notes. "Mom, I got a call this morning from Senator Patricia Morrison's office. She wants to use our case as the basis for federal legislation that would strengthen penalties for romance fraud and provide more resources for victims. This development represented something I had never expected when the nightmare began, the possibility that our experience could create systemic change that protected countless other women from similar predation. My assistant knocked on the conference room door and entered with a message that immediately captured my attention. "Mrs. Hartwell, there's a reporter from the Wall Street Journal here to see you. She says she's working on a follow-up story about women who've rebuilt their lives after financial betrayal." I had become somewhat accustomed to media requests in the months since Richard's sentencing, but this one intrigued me because it suggested the story had broader implications beyond our specific case. "Send her up in 15 minutes, I decided. I'd like to finish our board business first. Thomas Brennan, who had agreed to serve as our general counsel after retiring from his law practice, cleared his throat and consulted his legal pad. "Victoria, there's one more item we need to discuss. Richard's attorney contacted us yesterday with a request." The mention of Richard's name still caused a slight tightening in my chest, though it no longer carried the emotional devastation it once had. "What kind of request?" "He wants to schedule a meeting with you. Apparently, Richard has been undergoing counseling in prison and wants to make what his attorney calls, quote, genuine amends for his actions." The room fell silent as everyone waited for my response. I had not seen or spoken to Richard since the sentencing hearing and had no particular desire to change that situation. "What would be the purpose of such a meeting?" I asked. According to the attorney, Richard wants to provide information about other financial irregularities he was involved in before the Kellaway conspiracy. Apparently, there are additional assets that could be recovered. I considered this carefully. While I had no interest in facilitating Richard's attempt at redemption, if there were other victims who could benefit from recovered assets, my personal feelings seemed less important than their potential relief. "I'll think about it," I said finally. "But any such meeting would be conducted here, with our attorneys present, and focused solely on recovering assets for victims. I have no interest in personal reconciliation." After the board meeting concluded, I met with the Wall Street Journal reporter in my office, where the walls now displayed artwork I had selected myself, rather than pieces chosen to complement Richard's taste. "Mrs. Hartwell," the reporter began, "your story has inspired women across the country who found themselves in similar situations. What advice would you give to someone who discovers they're being financially manipulated by someone they trust?" I had been asked this question many times over the past year, and my answer had evolved as I gained perspective on my own experience. "The most important thing is to understand that financial abuse is about power and control, not money," I said. "The goal is to make you feel dependent and helpless so you won't fight back. The moment you realize what's happening, you need to start documenting everything and building your own support network." You maintained secret financial independence for years before the crisis. Do you recommend that all women do the same? I recommend that everyone, regardless of gender, maintains some level of financial independence within their relationships. It's not about distrust, it's about security. You can love someone completely while still protecting yourself from worst-case scenarios. The reporter nodded, making notes. "How has your relationship with your daughter been affected by everything that's happened?" I smiled, thinking about Catherine's strength throughout the ordeal and her decision to relocate to help with both the company and the foundation. "If anything, we're closer now. Going through this experience together showed us both that we could handle whatever life throws at us. Catherine has seen me at my most vulnerable and at my strongest, and I think that's deepened our relationship in ways that normal circumstances never could have." "What about forgiveness? Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive your ex-husband for what he did?" This was the question I had struggled with most over the past year. Forgiveness felt like something I should aspire to, but it also felt like something Richard hadn't earned through any genuine change or understanding of his actions. "I've forgiven myself for trusting someone who wasn't worthy of that trust," I said finally. "I've forgiven myself for not seeing warning signs that seem obvious in retrospect. As for Richard, forgiveness isn't something I owe him. It's something he would have to earn through genuine accountability and changed behavior, and I haven't seen evidence of either. After the reporter left, I stood at my office windows looking out at the city skyline where Hartwell Industries, now Victoria Industries, had become synonymous with ethical business practices and corporate transparency. The view reminded me of the conversation I'd had with Richard on the last morning of our marriage, when he'd casually informed me that our life together was over. He had expected me to be devastated, to quietly accept whatever terms he and his lawyers decided were fair, to fade gracefully into the background while he built a new life with his young mistress and her criminal family. Instead, his betrayal had revealed strengths I never knew I possessed and opportunities I never would have pursued if I had remained the supportive wife who hid her capabilities behind someone else's ambitions. The irony was perfect. Richard had destroyed our marriage in pursuit of wealth and power that had belonged to me all along, and in doing so, he had freed me to become the person I was always meant to be. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and continued growth for both the company and the foundation. But tonight, I would simply enjoy the satisfaction of having not only survived betrayal, but transformed it into something meaningful and powerful. The woman Richard had tried to destroy had become someone he never could have imagined, and someone he never would have deserved. 2 years after Richard's sentencing, I received an invitation that would bring my transformation full circle. Harvard Business School wanted me to deliver the keynote address at their annual Women in Leadership Conference. Standing at the podium in the same auditorium where Richard had once bragged about his business acumen to potential clients, I looked out at an audience of accomplished women and realized that my story had become something far greater than personal vindication. "Ladies," I began, my voice carrying the confidence that had been forged in crisis and tempered by success, "I want to tell you about the most valuable business lesson I ever learned, and it came from the most painful betrayal I ever experienced." The audience of executives, entrepreneurs, and graduate students leaned forward, drawn by the promise of hard-won wisdom that couldn't be found in any textbook. For 40 years, I believed that supporting someone else's success was the highest form of love I could offer. I subordinated my own ambitions, hid my own capabilities, and allowed someone else to take credit for achievements that were equally mine. I told myself this was partnership, but what I was actually doing was enabling someone else's sense of entitlement while diminishing my own power. I paused, scanning the faces in the audience and seeing recognition in many of their expressions. How many successful women had made similar sacrifices, believing that love required self-diminishment? The night my husband announced he was leaving me for his secretary, he told me I would need to, quote, adjust my lifestyle because our assets were tied up in his company. What he didn't know was that I owned that company, had owned it for 15 years through careful strategic investments that I had hidden from him to protect both our financial security and his ego. A murmur rippled through the audience as they grasped the implications of this revelation. Richard expected me to be devastated, to quietly accept whatever terms he offered, to fade gracefully into the background while he built a new life with stolen money and criminal conspirators. Instead, his betrayal revealed something I had never fully understood about myself. I had always been the stronger partner in our relationship. I had simply chosen to hide that strength behind his success. The speech I had carefully crafted over the past month wasn't just about financial fraud or criminal justice. It was about the broader patterns that allowed predators to target successful women by exploiting their willingness to support others at their own expense. The investigation that followed revealed that Richard and his accomplices had stolen over $8 million from my company, while planning to steal millions more through fraudulent divorce proceedings. But the most valuable discovery wasn't financial. It was the realization that I had been living far below my potential for decades. Catherine sat in the front row, beaming with pride as she watched her mother command the attention of some of the most successful women in business. Beside her, Rebecca Chen and Jennifer Walsh represented the team that had helped transform a personal crisis into a thriving enterprise that employed over 200 people and had become a model for ethical business practices. Today, the company Richard thought he owned is worth over $400 million. The foundation, established with recovered stolen funds, has helped more than 3,000 women escape financial manipulation. Federal legislation inspired by our case has strengthened penalties for romance fraud and provided new resources for victims. And I have discovered that building something myself feels infinitely more satisfying than supporting someone else's ambitions. The applause was spontaneous and sustained, reflecting not just appreciation for my story but recognition of its broader implications for every woman who had ever questioned her own worth or hidden her capabilities to avoid threatening someone else's ego. But here's what I want you to understand, I continued as the applause died down. Richard's betrayal wasn't the end of my story, it was the beginning of my real life. For 74 years, I had been living according to other people's expectations about what a woman of my generation should want and how she should behave. The moment I stopped caring about those expectations and started acting on my own capabilities, everything changed. During the question and answer session that followed, a young MBA student asked the question I had been hoping someone would raise. "Mrs. Hartwell, if you could go back and prevent Richard's betrayal, would you?" I considered the question carefully, understanding its deeper implications about growth, resilience, and the value of difficult experiences. "That's the question I've asked myself many times over the past 2 years," I admitted, "and my answer might surprise you. No, I wouldn't prevent it." Richard's betrayal was devastating, but it was also liberating. It forced me to discover strengths I never knew I possessed, and to build a life that reflects my own values and ambitions rather than someone else's expectations. "But didn't you lose 40 years of your life to a lie?" I gained 40 years of experience that prepared me for the challenge of rebuilding when everything collapsed. Every skill I developed while supporting Richard's career, strategic thinking, financial analysis, relationship building, crisis management, became invaluable when I needed to fight for my own survival. The difference is that now I'm using those skills for myself, rather than hiding them behind someone else's success. After the speech, I was approached by dozens of women who shared their own stories of financial manipulation, professional suppression, and relationships that demanded self-diminishment in exchange for security. Many of them were successful by external standards but felt trapped by circumstances that made them dependent on partners who didn't truly value their contributions. "The most important thing to remember," I told each of them, "is that it's never too late to reclaim your power." I was 72 years old when I discovered what I was really capable of. You don't have to wait for a crisis to start living authentically. That evening, Catherine and I had dinner at the same restaurant where Richard had once celebrated closing deals he couldn't have achieved without my financial backing. The irony of the location wasn't lost on either of us. "Mom, I've been thinking about something," Catherine said as we reviewed the events of the day. "Do you think Dad ever understood what he actually lost when he chose to betray you?" I considered her question while watching the city lights sparkle beyond the restaurant windows. I think Richard understood the financial consequences, eventually. But I don't think he ever grasped the personal loss. He spent 40 years married to a woman he never really knew, and he threw away the love of someone who would have helped him build an empire if he had simply been honest about what he wanted. Do you think he's learned anything in prison? I hope so for his sake. But ultimately, Richard's growth or lack thereof isn't my responsibility anymore. My job now is to help other women avoid the mistakes I made and to build something meaningful from the wisdom that came at such a high price. 6 months later, I received a letter from Richard, the first communication I had accepted from him since his sentencing. The letter was shorter than I expected, and more honest than his previous attempts at reconciliation. "Victoria," it read, "I finally understand what I lost when I betrayed you. And it wasn't the money or the company or even the comfortable life we had built together. I lost the respect and partnership of the strongest person I've ever known. I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't deserve another chance. I just wanted you to know that watching you succeed after everything I put you through has taught me more about real strength, than 40 years of marriage ever did. I read the letter once, filed it away, and returned to work on the quarterly report that would show Victoria Industries had become one of the fastest-growing companies in our sector. Richard had been right about one thing in his letter. He didn't deserve another chance. But what he had failed to understand was that his opinion no longer mattered to me. The woman he had tried to destroy had become someone who drew her strength from her own accomplishments rather than someone else's approval. After 40 years of marriage, he had left me for his secretary, thinking he could steal my company and disappear with my fortune. Instead, his betrayal had freed me to discover exactly who I had always been, beneath the role of supportive wife. A force to be reckoned with, a woman who built empires rather than hiding behind them, and someone who turned devastating betrayal into triumph that inspired thousands of others. The hidden fortune Richard never knew about wasn't just the money I had saved. It was the strength I had always possessed but never fully claimed until the moment I stopped living for someone else and started living for myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.